Prayer is one of the oldest and most fundamental practices of Christian life, but also one of the most challenging to understand. Many people ask, if God is omniscient, if he already knows everything we think, feel, and need, why should we pray? This doubt is legitimate and has crossed the minds of many Christians throughout history. After all, wouldn't it be redundant to ask God for something he already knows? And furthermore, if the Lord has already determined all things, what role does our prayer have within his sovereign will? These questions, which seem simple at first glance, lead us to deep reflections on God's character, the relationship between creator and creature, and the true purpose of prayer in the believer's life. According to the Bible, prayer is not merely a tool to ask God for things, but primarily a means of relationship with him. When Jesus taught the disciples to pray in the well-known Our Father, he did not simply instruct them to present needs, but to approach God as Father, recognizing his holiness and sovereignty before any request. Prayer, therefore, is first and foremost a meeting of intimacy, a way to align the human heart with the divine heart. Philippians 4-6 reminds us, do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. In other words, we do not pray because God does not know, but because we need to place ourselves before him with trust, acknowledging our dependence. Furthermore, prayer is an exercise of faith. To pray is to believe that God hears, responds, and cares for us, even though he knows all our words before we speak them. As Psalm 139-4 declares, the Bible also affirms that he desires to hear the voice of his children. Prayer is the practical expression that we believe in his goodness and trust that he acts on our behalf. That is why Hebrews 11-6 says, without faith it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. To pray, then, is an act of trust, surrender, and hope. Another essential aspect is that prayer transforms us. Many times we approach prayer thinking of changing circumstances around us, but in reality, the ones who change the most are ourselves. When we kneel, our priorities are realigned, our anxieties are released, and our hearts find rest. Paul writes in 2 Coríntios 13:18 that as we contemplate the Lord's glory, we are being transformed into his image. Prayer is precisely that moment when, by beholding God's presence, we are shaped. We pray not only for God to do something for us, but for him to do something in us. It is also important to remember that Jesus, even being the Son of God, prayed constantly. If prayer were unnecessary, Christ would not have spent so many nights in prayer, nor would he have withdrawn to solitary places to talk with the Father. In John 17, we see one of the most beautiful recorded prayers where Jesus intercedes for the disciples and for all who would believe in him in the future. This shows us that prayer is not an empty ritual, but a living and transformative dialogue with God. If Christ himself, who had perfect communion with the Father, felt the need to pray, how much more do we, in our weakness, need this practice? Finally, we must understand that prayer is not a tool to change God's will, but to align our will with his. When we pray, we acknowledge that we are limited, but he is sovereign and perfect. Prayer is surrender, trust, relationship. It is the way we set aside self-sufficiency and yield to the Father's care. As Jesus said in Gethsemane, Father, not as I will, but as you will. Matthew 26-39. Prayer, therefore, is not useless in the face of God as say omniscience, but essential to Christian life. It strengthens faith, brings peace to the heart, and draws us closer to the one who created us. That is why, even though he already knows everything, God desires his children to pray not to inform him, but to transform us in his presence